Thank you all for attending today. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know a little bit about Cancer and Careers for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We were founded in 2001, and we are the only organization in the US solely focused on work and cancer issues. So we provide support through a number of programs and resources. All of our programs and resources are always provided free of charge. Our website is our main hub for information on our programs and services, which, as was mentioned in my intro, just include conferences, webinars. We also offer publications in English and in Spanish. We have a website. I'm sorry?
We are trying to get the camera open for the people that's in the room so that they can see you. So if you can give us 1 second, sorry.
Sure, no problem.
No.
Okay, there we go.
No, but that's it's not the hour.
All right, now, hi. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
Yes?
I don't know if you guys want to maybe just mute while I'm presenting.
Can you hear us? Yes, now it is working. Okay, sorry.
Okay. So just as I was mentioning, we have publications that are available in English and Spanish. We also have a Spanish website available as well. We started doing webinars in Spanish as well this year. So we're really working on expanding that aspect of our offerings. We also offer online career coaching and a resume review service. And as I mentioned, everything is free. So I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the constantly shifting landscape due to the pandemic, and really just how it's impacting all of our lives in one way or another, both personally and professionally. There are those that are working from home, others who have recently returned to their workplaces or had to work throughout the pandemic. And then, of course, unfortunately, those that have lost employment or have had their hours significantly reduced. So I definitely recognize that everybody might be in different situations at this time. So to really get us started, I want to jump right to the heart of the work and cancer conversation, and that is the diagnosis and work dilemma. So when deciding about working through or soon after treatment, the first thing that you need to do is look at the big picture and really think about the many often competing pieces to making a decision about work in light of your cancer diagnosis. All the unknowns can feel understandably overwhelming. This makes it important in moments like these to acknowledge the reality of what's going on, and then from there start to isolate and answer some of those specific questions in order to illuminate what the best path forward for you would be. It's also important to recognize that sometimes the answers to these questions are naturally in conflict with one another, but acknowledging that conflict and making an informed decision with that in mind can be really critical in this process. So 2 key questions that you can ask yourself are, how important is work to you personally? And then what information do you need in order to make good decisions about work? And of course, I want to acknowledge many of you may be past the initial moment of making work decisions in light of your diagnosis. And if you are, that's okay. Some of these may still be helpful to think through how to make sure what you're doing is working for you, or to keep on hand as things in your treatment may change. So inevitably, as I mentioned, the answers to these 2 questions can lead to a host of additional questions, because as we know, what we want is not always what we can do. So the question really becomes, how do you find a path that's workable for you? Some additional questions to consider include, how will work affect your treatment and schedule? and vice versa. So when talking with your healthcare team about that, it's going to be really important. You'll want to think about things like, when are your side effects likely to kick in? Now, with some treatments, people feel unwell almost immediately, in which case maybe they can schedule treatment for a Friday so they have the weekend to recover. With other treatment protocols, the effects don't really kick in until a few days later, in which case maybe scheduling the appointment for a Wednesday might make a little bit more sense. Of course, that's if you are working in a job that has typical Monday through Friday scheduling. So I just encourage you all to be proactive and to really ask for the times that are going to work best for you and your schedule. And of course, no person is only their diagnosis and their job. So what other things will you want to save time for and energy for? A new hobby or a personal project? Or maybe you're the one who does all the cooking and the cleaning at the home. The truth is that each of us has a very limited pool of internal resources and energy that we divvy up into our own personal pie chart. And so when cancer gets added to that mix, that pie gets smaller and smaller as treatment continues and prioritizing becomes even more important. Now, for many people, finances and insurance are tied to their jobs and are very important. So often those are actually the driving factors in determining whether to work or not during treatment. Or maybe they're important, but they're not the number one reason. Many people want to continue working because first and foremost, it's part of their identity. It's who they are, particularly in this country where when we meet someone for the first time, we ask, what do you do? Not what's your favorite food or have you read any good books lately? We're basically asking, how do you contribute to the world, which is a pretty profound question. So for some people, finding out that their ability to work will be compromised can lead to a secondary crisis, an identity one. So in these cases, it can be helpful to talk with your healthcare team, including a social worker, about ways in which you can take care of yourself emotionally if it does look like your capacity to work may become impacted. So as part of an information gathering process, we separate the necessary information that you're going to want to gather into 3 buckets. We talked a little bit about this first bucket, which is medical and treatment information, but it's really important to understand the timeline, the treatment options you have, what your healthcare team is recommending, and to get input from all the members of your healthcare team, since they have obviously had a lot of experience with this and may be able to guide you in certain decisions around it based on what your preferences might be for work. And then you want to look into workplace information. So this includes company policies and culture, workplace flexibilities that may exist, and of course, what your job demands are. And then the last bucket is legal information. So it's critical to have a little bit of legal fact-finding in advance. Understanding what federal and state laws provide protections that you might be entitled to at work. Ultimately, practical and legal issues don't exist in vacuums. So laws really exist as a tool, but unfortunately people live in fear of them. So the larger goal is really just to demystify some of those for you all today, to know that there are some laws that can be helpful in these kinds of situations. So for the purposes of today's discussion, I do want to just discuss one key law in order to help provide a foundation for any additional fact-finding that may be necessary. So this law is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So to start, the ADA is a federal law, which means that it applies in all 50 states. So the part relevant to work in cancer comes from Title I, and like all laws, it does have certain requirements that you must meet in order to use it. So in really broad strokes, those requirements are that your employer must have a minimum of 15 employees for the law to apply to them. You must have the necessary skills, certifications, experience, etc., to do the job. And finally, your disability must meet the criteria as it's determined by the ADA. So if you meet all of these requirements, the ADA can protect you from discrimination and may also provide access to something called reasonable accommodations, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Again, this is really just a quick overview so you know that the ADA is something to consider, and I encourage you to speak with a legal professional to really determine if you're eligible to use the ADA's protections. I do also want to point out that there are state fair employment laws that exist as well. And sometimes these provide even more protection than the ADA. So for example, a lot of states actually have a much lower minimum number of employees that must be employed by the company in order for the protections to go and apply to them. So I believe New York is 1 person. So no one would really want to be discriminating against themselves, but that's just suffice to say that, you know, there are other options in the event that this isn't going, that you don't meet all the requirements for this eligibility. So this brings us to disclosure. So whether or not to disclose at work or in other areas of your life is an incredibly personal decision and one that really requires a lot of thought. What's important to know and remember here is that you're not required or obligated to share your health or health history with an employer, nor can they ask. So a lot of individuals with cancer often confuse omitting with lying, but it's personal information and it's not necessary to share any or all personal information with your employer. It can often come down to how you feel about sharing your own personal information. So additional considerations include why you want to share. Is it because you feel you want to? Is it because you know it's necessary in order to access certain protections or benefits? There's no right answer. It's really just about what your specific needs and preferences are. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. So when I get questions regarding whether or not to disclose, I like to say that you can always say more later, but you can never say less. So if there is a need for you to divulge more information down the road, you can and you should be prepared to do so, but just know that you don't have to offer it up right away. Seeing disclosure on a spectrum, like on this slide, can really help you to make the decision of what, how much, and to whom you'll be sharing that information. And finally, what do you know so far? When you're considering disclosure, it's important to share what you know to be true and not necessarily the what ifs, because as we know with cancer, there are a million what ifs and you never can really predict the future. So getting accurate information from your healthcare provider around timelines and treatment protocols can be helpful, but you don't necessarily want to tell your employer that things are definitive because circumstances can always change. So if you do decide to disclose, let them know that what you're telling them is what you know to be true right now, and this can change, and that if it does, you will continue to communicate with them. Assuring your employer that the dialogue will be open can often help ease some of their concerns around being kept in the loop and might make them a little bit more amenable to working with whatever your needs might be in that time. Now, when it comes to disclosing at work, as I mentioned, it is a personal decision and it does involve a lot of considerations. It's also typically not an all or nothing scenario. So as I mentioned, and we'll continue to remind everyone, you are not required to provide information about your health or your health history to your employer, current or prospective, nor can they ask. However, there can be situations where you might have to share information in order to access your rights under the law. So this doesn't mean sharing every last detail about your diagnosis or your prognosis, but rather it just means you might have to provide some support for why you're asking for or why you're eligible for whatever it is that you're asking for. So an example might be, it would be difficult to credibly file a complaint against your employer for discrimination under the ADA if they technically had no idea you had a condition to discriminate against. So really, as you're thinking through whether to share or not, it is important to consider all of these angles. We have a couple of resources on our website, some articles just discussing what disclosure in the workplace might look like and just some considerations that go along with it. So when you are making this decision of sharing or not about your cancer status at work, there are two major things to consider overall. So first is how will treatment interfere with your ability to perform your duties? And then what legal benefits are there to sharing this information? So with any personal decisions, there are different reasons that people choose to disclose. Some people are sharers. They can't imagine going through such a big life-changing event and not telling. But others feel very uncomfortable sharing their personal information and may prefer to be much more private. Really, however you feel about sharing is valid and should really be taken into account. The individual culture of the workplace may also play a role. Thinking about the various ways that people communicate with each other at work may help you decide if, how, and how much you want to share that information at work. You may also think about whether anyone in your workplace has gone through something similar. It can be incredibly valuable to consider these experiences as you begin to think about what you can expect out of your own experience as you share this information. And this isn't necessarily thinking of someone who's specifically gone through cancer treatment, but rather perhaps it's someone that's gone on maternity leave or someone who had to take some time off to care for a family member. You know, thinking about how is that news received? How are coworkers supportive? Were they supportive? Was there grumbling about taking on extra work? Just things like that can really inform your decisions. Now, when you're contemplating who to tell, that's going to vary depending on you and your specific circumstances. It's also possible you might find yourself having to have more than one disclosure conversation. So if that's the case, we recommend starting with the person that is going to be the easiest to talk to. For many people, that's a direct supervisor because it's someone with whom they have an ongoing conversation with and who could potentially be an advocate for them with the higher ups. But it's also important to remember that most managers are not trained to be managers, and so it can be really hard for them to have these conversations in the sense that they don't know how to handle them, and this is the first time that they're handling them as well. So just keeping that in mind can be really helpful as you are having these conversations. We do have a resource called our Manager's Toolkit, which is something that you can give directly to a supervisor that kind of outlines just some ways that they can be supportive of you and what some of your needs might be. For other people, their supervisor is out of the question, so they may want to go to HR instead. The HR department can be a font of information because they are the ones who understand the employee handbook that holds all the policies, and they may even have experience with others who have been in similar circumstances. Perhaps the most important thing to disclose in any of these conversations is the idea that treatment is going to be fluid, as we've discussed, and helping them understand that the things you're sharing are what you know today, but they may not apply next week or next month or 6 months from now. And so the understanding needs to be that this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation. This can really help your employer understand that you intend to communicate with them the most updated information that you can. And again, put them a little bit more at ease that they're going to be kept in the loop and not have any huge surprises to come their way. Now, with all of that said, the idea of simply getting the ball rolling in terms of a conversation at work is one that can be really intimidating for a lot of survivors, which is totally understandable. Overall, when you're preparing to begin these conversations, be sure to weave in the idea that you want to collaborate with your employer to create a plan that ensures that both your needs and their needs are going to be met. I have here a couple of examples of how one might start that conversation. Of course, this is, just sample language. If it works for you, great. If not, you can change it around to make it sound a little bit more like you and to fit your circumstance a little bit better. I will send a copy of these slides to Maisha after this so that she can distribute it to them. So don't feel the need to speed read right now. We'll have access to them later. Now, part of the disclosure decision also includes figuring out how much to share and with whom, which can involve considering, what are the possible likely side effects you're going to experience. Particularly if you're choosing not to disclose either at all or widely within your organization, because the changes that our bodies can go through during treatment, whether they're visible side effects like hair loss or weight loss or skin changes, or those that are invisible side effects like cognitive challenges or a decrease in overall energy levels, can often disclose some information even if your words don't. So if you're someone who isn't planning to or has decided already not to disclose widely, it can be a good idea to have a sense of the type of changes that you're likely to experience and whether those might be perceived by your coworkers in a way that may invite a lot of questions. So from there, it's really about knowing how to have prepared responses to any questions that might arise so that you don't accidentally share any information that you would have preferred to keep quiet. So as we discuss side effects, of course, chemo brain and brain fog is one that we get asked about the most frequently. This type of fog can come about whether you've received chemotherapy or not. While there's no magic bullet solution, one piece of advice is to let go of the idea of multitasking, because studies show that only 2% of people multitask effectively, and I can certainly speak to that on my own experience. So to combat this, we recommend just going back to the basics. Write down a list of priorities, then turn off your phone or email notifications so they don't cause too many distractions, and really focus on one thing at a time. Writing everything down is a good idea, so that you always have a record of things and you don't have to rely on your memory so much, which can be challenging when it's feeling pretty foggy. Try to keep a single notebook with all of your to-do things in one place. This way you don't wind up in a meeting with your grocery list instead of your talking points. Additionally, it's a good idea to take the time to rehearse everything from presentations to project updates and even phone calls. If you work in an office type environment that has a shared calendar, you may want to schedule time for yourself on that public calendar so that people know that you're busy. Also, simple stress relief practices can go a really long way to help improving your focus. Deep breathing exercises or 2 to 3 minutes of meditation can easily be done at a desk or while taking a short walk. A little bit can really go a long way in terms of helping us to hit that reset button, especially to kind of get clarity in your mind when it is starting to feel a little fuzzy. It's also helpful to take some time to think about how to communicate at work, specifically with supervisors and coworkers around maybe some of your changing needs. It's a good idea to ask for priorities, create a written plan, know your limits, and set boundaries. This is really important to remember that the way that we communicate at work is different than how we communicate at home. So despite being exhausted, it's important to obviously still communicate in a professional manner when you're at work. So what can help with this is using what we call professional no's. Again, I'm not going to read these out loud. You guys can have access to them later. But these are really great to practice so that you can really identify the language that feels comfortable for you in the event that you are put on the spot where you need to set some clear boundaries, because boundaries are a really big challenge for everybody, especially when you might feel that you're at a disadvantage because of treatment and how you're feeling and things like that. So definitely take a look at these. We also have a recorded webinar on setting boundaries on our website that's really helpful in terms of kind of explaining what the significance and importance is of setting boundaries and how they can really help to empower you in the workplace. Now, as you make the return to work, one strategy to use is reasonable accommodations, which I mentioned earlier are one benefit of the ADA if you do qualify. Basically, these are tools that can be used to make working through treatment or returning to work after treatment much more manageable. It's easier to think about how these might work with examples. So there's a few on the next slides. But before we move on, just to note that there is a lot of information on reasonable accommodations, what they are, how to use them, and how they can be valuable for both you and your employer. So you can check out our website as well as the 3 resources on this slide to help you get started. But ultimately, the Job Accommodation Network is a really great resource. They even provide ideas for what accommodations you could request based on specific symptoms and side effects that you're experiencing. They also provide letter templates that can be really helpful in terms of making that formal request to your employer. So there's also a number of questions that you can ask yourself to help identify some potential accommodations. So some examples include, can you work a full-time but flexible schedule? So this would mean you ultimately work the same number of hours, they're just distributed differently. So perhaps varying the start and end times of the workday to maximize the hours that you're feeling best can be a really big help. So perhaps a 9 to 5 day might become a 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. day if you find that you have the most energy early in the morning and then by the afternoon you start to slump a little bit. Or you can take time out during the workday to go to appointments and then make that time up by working later that day or later in the week. Again, this may not work for every kind of job, but it could be a really great solution for those who do project-based work. Maybe also exploring whether you can work from home part-time or full-time. So similar to changing working hours, this may not work for every type of job, in particular those who need to be maybe customer or client facing, but it is becoming much more commonplace, especially following the pandemic. So it's possible that there may already be a policy about this in your employee handbook, and if not, perhaps one could be created. Among other things, this can eliminate a draining commute, reserving energy to work, but it also can allow you to protect your compromised immune system during cold and flu season and potentially avoiding public transportation for the same reason. If your job includes allocated break times, is it possible for you to take more frequent or additional breaks? So let's say your schedule entitles you to 2 breaks and a 45-minute lunch, but what you really need is a total of 4 breaks in your day. Those extra breaks could potentially be considered an accommodation in this scenario. It could be about getting access to special equipment. So for those who might be suffering from neuropathy and they know they have a lot of typing to do in their job, considering if there's any speak to text software that you can use instead of having to type it all out is a really great option for you as well. Another possibility might be to have certain tasks or projects moved from your job. So let's say you work the front desk at a law office, and one of your responsibilities is to change the water cooler. Obviously, that's not an essential responsibility of your job. So if that's something that could be moved to someone else, that would be a huge help for you and take a little bit of that pressure off. Again, these are really just examples meant to help you start thinking about accommodations and just to remove some of the myths around the concept that they're expensive or unlikely to be approved. According to the Job Accommodation Network, most accommodations cost an employer $500 or less, and many actually cost nothing. So be resourceful and really think about your environment and what might be causing the specific challenges that you're experiencing. And just really remember that it's all fluid. What would make work easier today might be different tomorrow. This isn't a one-time only opportunity, and you're able to ask for more than one accommodation if necessary. So if you ask for one and you find that you need another, it's totally justified to ask for another one. There's no specific limit. Now, when we think about returning to an existing job, it can present a number of challenges, whether you've been away for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or perhaps more. There are pros and cons to returning to a former job. Probably the biggest pro is that it's a familiar landscape. You know the culture and the quirks, you know your colleagues, you know the responsibilities that are associated with your particular role. All of these things mean that you won't have to spend the time assessing and acclimating to a new work environment. Of course, there are also cons associated with returning to a previous job. There's the very sneaky and sometimes insidious before cancer picture. So it's wise to remind yourself that it's okay, and in fact, it's a good idea to ease back into your routine. Remind is an operative word here, of course, as this is much easier said than done, but it's a helpful seed to have planted in the back of your mind. Now at CSC, we frequently hear from people that they have a very real fear that they're going to be branded as the cancer person in their office forever. We've heard stories about colleagues making cancer-related comments to people who are returning to work, and typically these are well-intentioned attempts to connect with the person in some way, but that doesn't mean that they don't feel extremely off-putting. So what you can do in these situations is to use something, a verbal technique that we call the swivel. It's a verbal formula or pattern used in response to a cancer-related comment that might be made by one of those well-intended colleagues. It involves acknowledging the cancer-related comment, putting an "and" right in the middle, and swiveling the conversation back around to something that's more work-oriented and appropriate. So there's a few examples on this slide. Maybe it's your first week back and your coworker comes over to you and says in that voice that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the "how are you feeling?" which has a lot more meaning than is maybe intended, but you can say something along the lines of, "I'm really excited to be back. In fact, I have a few questions about that new time card system that was implemented. Do you have a minute to answer them?" Really being able to shift the conversation back to a place where you feel comfortable can be empowering and also indicate to your colleagues that you're still that whole vibrant person with a lot of professional contributions to make, and also let them know that you're not interested in talking about your personal information. So moving on from returning to an existing job, I want to spend a little time talking about the job search. So we have some data from our 2021 survey with Harris Poll that we conduct every year and a half to help provide some context. So the first 3 data points are responses from patients and survivors who were looking for work. As you can see, they focus primarily on some of the fears around the impact of a diagnosis on work prospects and really the possibility of upward mobility. These are valid concerns given the two stats that are listed below it, like applicants who disclose their cancer history receiving fewer callbacks from managers than those who did not disclose their cancer history. So this information is not meant to scare you or to paint a negative picture by any means, but rather this way that you have this information in the back of your mind that helps to make you the savviest candidate during your job search. I'll also spend some time just talking a little bit more about the disclosure piece during job search. So hopefully after today, you'll leave here feeling a little bit more empowered around that piece of the puzzle, which can really trip people up a lot. So, of course, the pandemic has shifted the landscape of work as we know it. Many jobs that would have never been performed remotely or from home were done throughout the lockdown and beyond. There was a recognition that many of these jobs were done just as well, and in some cases, maybe even better than if they had been in person or in the office. This has created many new opportunities for flexibility for employees, the ability to make positions work best for employees, and also allowed a certain level of control in the job search process in terms of what's needed. Many job search platforms openly promote positions that are defined as remote, but there is also the opportunity to explore whether an employer would be open to allowing working from home, even if the job didn't necessarily call for it, or perhaps maybe a hybrid schedule, so working from the office a few days a week and working from home the other. Depending where you are in the hiring process, it can be worth asking what the flexibilities and openness to such an arrangement would be. I did present a webinar last night that will be posted to our website probably early next week, discussing the challenges of remote work and some of the strategies that can be applied in order to alleviate or even eliminate some of the obstacles. So if you're interested in exploring a little bit more about remote work, certainly feel free to check that out. It'll be on our video archive. Thinking about the job search process itself, it's no secret that there are many challenges and unknowns that are involved. It can feel scary, and particularly during this challenging time following a diagnosis, it might seem impossible to do. So to start, remember that looking for a job is a process. It can take time. And while it might not feel like it right now, you should think about what you want and not just what you need. And then from there, be strategic about your approach. The job hunt also comes with huge ups and downs, so it can be helpful to talk to a social worker about how you'll manage the emotional roller coaster effectively. We've noticed over the years that people in the cancer community tend to hold themselves to a much higher standard than others who are looking for work. Often survivors feel obligated to share more of their health history than they have to or really should. So we like to say that job search is like building any relationship. It's about timing with various steps involved. The process builds upon itself, and it can be heavily focused on a great first impression. So your resume, cover letter, LinkedIn profile, etc. So if we were to use dating as an example of relationship building, the first phone conversation with a potential date is going to have a much different feel to it than, let's say, a marriage proposal would. So if someone shows up on a first date and is like an open book, sharing all of their idiosyncrasies and quirks immediately, that information is going to read much differently than if it were to come up in 6 weeks or 6 months. So you want to think in the same way, you're not going to go on a first job interview and admit that you chew gum really, really loudly, or that you always sign on to the Zoom meetings just a couple minutes late. So I encourage you to keep in mind that it's important to behave appropriately based on the context of which stage you're at in the job search process. And then projecting appropriate confidence is a really great way to do this. And finally, during this time where so much can feel and is out of our control, there are elements of job searching that you can focus on right now that are completely within your control. So things like working on your resume, perfecting a cover letter, getting into the habit of networking, and really embracing this new virtual way that everyone's connecting can be really, really helpful. There's also certain things you should consider if you are job searching right now during the pandemic. So besides the practical questions like what companies are hiring and what jobs are available, you'll also want to try to find out what the safety measures and policies employers are implementing and how important those are to you. So this will likely be unique to your specific situation. So just think about what you're comfortable with, what's safe, and this should likely include conversations with your healthcare provider just to get their perspective and then also add in your own personal feelings about it. Now, thinking through the steps of a job search, networking is one that is cited as an early part of the process. According to one of our career coaches that works with us, currently more than 85% of jobs are found through networking versus through job boards, headhunters, or ads online. So it goes without saying that networking is a necessary part of the job hunting process. A lot of people tend to struggle with the idea of networking because it feels like they're asking for a favor, which can feel especially challenging if you've been out of the game for a while due to treatment or recovery. But the fact is that basically anyone you know can be a source for networking. Those of you who are in the office right now could turn to the person next to you and find out if there's anyone that they could connect you with. There's also great online resources for this. Of course, LinkedIn, which I imagine a lot of you are familiar with, is the Facebook for professionals. LinkedIn has really become the go-to resource for employers that are looking to hire. According to a recent study, 87% of recruiters reported that LinkedIn is the most effective tool when they're vetting during the job search process. So given that it's being used so much to find talent, you want to make sure that you're utilizing it to its fullest potential. So you can do this by writing a compelling profile, asking for strategic and substantive recommendations, posting professional updates, and joining groups to follow that would be helpful as you start your search. Now, of course, as important as networking and LinkedIn and your overall online presence are for job searching, they don't replace the time-tested tool of job hunting, which are the resume and the cover letter. I'm likely not telling you something you don't already know, but let's just review some tips on how to write them. So an effective resume is one that's written with a particular audience in mind. It's professional, it's easy to read, and it has impact. It summarizes your accomplishments succinctly rather than being an exhaustive list of everything you've ever done work-wise. The rule of thumb is typically 1 page for an early career professional, 2 pages for someone more seasoned. And finally, a compelling resume must be future-focused and really targeted towards your career goal. And as mentioned, also vitally important is the cover letter or cover email. Along with your resume, it really helps get you in the door. So what's key to know about a cover letter is that it should really be tailored to the specific job that you're applying for. I can't tell you how many cover letters I've seen submitted to even jobs at Cancer and Careers where the person forgot to replace whatever job they had applied to before with our name and the job title. So it's just really important to be really careful about that stuff because it doesn't suggest the attention to detail that you mentioned in your resume if you're getting the name of the company wrong. It's also important to make sure that a cover letter isn't simply a regurgitation of your resume. So it's really an opportunity to draw parallels or highlight experience that makes you uniquely suited to the role. You also want to make connections between your specific skill set and experiences to the specific job and company that you're interested in, especially if you are looking to do a bit of a career change and you may not have all of the qualifications and requirements that are listed on the job description. It doesn't mean that you'll be ruled out, but if you can make those connections and kind of put together a good argument, it can be really helpful. Also, as I mentioned, I just want to do a little plug for our resume review service. As I mentioned, it is free of charge, and you can submit your resume for review to our volunteer career coach. So as I mentioned earlier, disclosure is an important aspect to consider when it comes to the job search. A lot of people ask us if they should include their cancer experience in their resume or cover letter, either as a positive or as an explanation of some sort. My first response is always do whatever you're comfortable with, but think about it like this. The goal of a cover letter and resume are to get you an interview based on your skills and your potential. So in that sense, your diagnosis and treatment aren't really a part of that conversation. Another important thing to consider is the fact that if you were to disclose your diagnosis in a letter, it won't be a dynamic exchange. And by that, I mean you won't physically be there when the employer initially absorbs that information. So you won't have the opportunity to explain anything or answer any questions they may have, or to steer them back to questions about your skills and experience. So the bottom line that I tried to get across today is that no one tells everything about everything during a job interview or even once they're hired. Communicating appropriately for where you are in the process and doing whatever feels right for you is really important. However, even if you are 100% sure that you want to disclose during the hiring process, the cover letter and resume are not really the best way to do that. If you do feel that it's important to let your employer know about your health history before you accept a job, and I've certainly met a number of people for whom that was very important, we typically recommend that you wait until later in the hiring process. So this way, everyone involved in hiring has a chance to spend time with you and really get a sense of who you are as a person and as an employee. That is, instead of just reading that information in your cover letter and putting it immediately into the no pile. So if you think back to the job searching is like dating slide, it's about sharing information based on where you are in the process. And of course, always remembering that you're never required to share that information right off the bat. Now, a lot of people come to us with concerns about a resume gap. So when you are asked about a resume gap, putting a positive spin on the situation can really help greatly to put the recruiter or interviewer at ease and really confirm that the gap doesn't have to do with a negative work ethic or laziness. Since the recession in 2008, resume gaps have become much more common. And so it's not as much of a red flag as it used to be, but it is totally possible and reasonable that you'll be asked about a gap on your resume. So it's a good idea to be prepared with some answers for that. So if it comes up, be future focused, non-specific, and brief. So this slide has a couple of useful swivel examples that you can use in such an interview situation. Again, spend some time figuring out language that feels right for you and comfortable if someone were to ask about the gap on your resume. You want that answer to acknowledge the question and then swivel the interviewer's attention back to the job in question, the desire to get hired, and the skill set that's on the table. And again, you can be vague about it. The example on this slide refers to a family issue. I'd say that cancer is certainly a family issue. So again, this is one of those situations where people get tripped up on the omitting versus lying, but ultimately you don't have to tell them what the exact situation was. It was a situation you were dealing with, you have resolved it since then, and now you're ready for this job, and that's what you need to get across. So it's really important to try to find out as much as you can about a company and prospective employer before you meet with them. Obviously, knowing about the company is going to help you sound informed in an interview, but it's also smart to spend some time thinking about whether the company is going to be a good fit for your needs. If the interview is a result of having networked with someone that works there, then you might already have a sense of what it's like to work at the organization, but you'll still want to do a little bit of additional information gathering yourself. So in other words, you want to do some fact finding beyond the conversations that happen as part of the interview process. Things like Googling whether there have ever been any discrimination lawsuits in the past. Taking a look at Glassdoor is a really great website because you can hear directly from current and past employees about what their experience has been. You can also find out about what benefits are offered, what the salaries might look like, things like that. So it can be really helpful just in terms of doing your due diligence on finding out whether the organization is going to be a good fit. So when we think about working in a new job with an employer, the pros and cons are kind of the opposite than the ones we talked about when you are returning to an existing role. So one of the best things about starting a new job with a new employer is that it's a fresh start. According to coaches, research shows that your first 90 days in a new job are the make it or break it time for success. So this is the time when you're assimilating, you are managing your energy, you're meeting new people, learning the culture, developing new relationships. You want to remember that you don't need to work a million hours in order to be successful. You should focus instead on creating a simple plan for the few things I just mentioned, and then really breaking everything down into small pieces so that when it feels overwhelming, you feel like you can really manage it a little bit better. It's also important for you to learn and understand what it means to be successful in your new company, and to really remember that every company is just a little bit dysfunctional. And sometimes learning those dysfunctions are what helps you to succeed in the environment. It's important to take care of yourself physically and mentally, and really remember that people don't get hired in the hopes that they will fail. They get hired in the hopes that they will succeed. So finding the right person for a job is consuming and costly. So your new employer is going to want to make sure that they can do everything possible to make a success out of your employment. And I think having that little seed planted in the back of your head when you do start a new job can be really helpful when you are already a little bit worried about preconceived notions and some limitations that you may be feeling, because ultimately you have to remind yourself that you got that job. They chose you. They felt that you were the right person for that job. And so kind of reminding yourself of that can also instill the confidence that can be lacking after going through a cancer experience. So that's it in terms of content for me today. I do want to just point out we have one more webinar scheduled for the end of our year. This one is going to be on balancing work and caregiving. So this is directed towards caregivers. We will be releasing our schedule of 2023 webinars probably in the next month or so. And we also have our virtual Midwest conference on working cancer. So since it is virtual, it's open to everyone in the US. It used to be in Chicago pre-pandemic days, but now that it's virtual, it is accessible to all. And again, that is free to register and attend. Here are just a couple of our programs and services that I've mentioned throughout. Our resume review service, our video archive houses all of our webinars that we've held throughout the past couple of years. We have free publications available, and we also have an Ask a Career message board, which provides access to some of our volunteer career coaches for specific questions and scenarios that patients and survivors want to run by them. And then here are a couple of legal organizations and resources that can be helpful as you do explore some of the protections that might be available to you, or in the event that you unfortunately do need to speak with a legal representative to identify if you are being discriminated against.